Have you ever run a boss battle that just fell flat? Either because the players made such short work of it that you all just felt bummed afterwards, or that it took ages and was boring the whole time? I think the issue might be that your encounter was a little undercooked. You know, like food. I tend to think of D&D boss battles as featuring several key ingredients, each providing essential spice and balance to the feeling of a climactic final end boss. When you take these ingredients and mix them perfectly, you cannot fumble the boss fight. It will be memorable. So let me introduce you to the 6 essential ingredients to any boss fight, how they work together, and then line up some bonus tips at the end. I promise your next end boss will be epic. Welcome to Mystic Arts, where I want your main takeaway from this video be that Cleric Beast is the ideal way to start boss battles. My name is Daði, I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for 10 years. Okay, picture this. You're at a fancy restaurant, dressed in your finest dining clothes with your significant other on a special occasion. Getting the seats at this particular time was a challenge because it's a very popular restaurant. So you booked this 2 years in advance. You invested some serious money in this. And when your main course arrives, it's a single cut of round steak and nothing else. No sides, no sauce, no drink. Just the cut of the meat, and it's not even cooked the way you asked. And to boot, it's sitting on a cheap IKEA plate, and all you've got is a fork and butter knife. There aren't even candles, just those overhead fluorescent lights that make you feel like you're in an office. That'd be pretty disappointing, to say the least. That wouldn't feel like a fancy restaurant at all. You're just eating raw meat in a plain room. All right. Maybe I'm stretching the analogy just a bit, but hear me out. I think we've all run the boss battle equivalent of the meat room at one point in our lives. What if, instead of this meat room, we crafted a meal complete with sides, drinks, and presentation? We made it a worthwhile experience, because the players may not have had to put down a reservation 2 years ago, but if this is your final end boss, the climax of the campaign, you might have been playing for years, and it'll have the weight of expectations on it. And you can let folks down here. The disappointment can be palpable. That's rough, but we're going to fix that right now. If you're running a boss battle at the end of a shorter adventure, you don't need anything too crazy, but knowing the principles behind end boss design will let you scale down those adventure-ending boss fights too. You just need to look at 6 crucial ingredients. So in this steak analogy, the steak is the boss monster. That's our first ingredient, the meat. You could get all kinds of steak, but it's important that we start with the right cut of meat. Something level appropriate. A cheap cut, in our analogy, like the round steak, could be the representative of a boss monster best described as being low interest. Basically, a boss that's largely just a big bag of hit points with a mean swing that'll scare the crap out of the players. Cheaper cuts have their place, so do low interest boss monsters. But for your campaign ender, you want something extravagant, like the filet mignon. Tender, mild, expensive. It'll chew easy, and it's rich in flavor. A high interest boss monster. Something that has loads of options and is fun to run. What is that? What are we looking for? Like with every fight, you're looking for variety. But since this is the boss monster, the variety has to be baked into the stat block, not just spread around the battlefield. Let's imagine we're about to run a final end boss at 13th level for a capable party of 6, and they've got a healthy chunk of magic items and some time to prepare. Here's a few tricks to convert a stat block and make it interesting. Let's imagine we start with the Storm Giant from the 2024 Monster Manual. It's a good cut to begin with, right? The stat block is interesting without us doing anything. It's rich in flavor. Look, it has some immunities and resistances, a swim speed and a fly speed. It's got true sight, and the multi-attack has variance baked into it. It can use a Storm Sword and a Thunderbolt in any combination. So good at both range and melee, but better in melee. Already, I've got loads of ideas. Swim speed and cold resistance tells me a lot about the environment, but we'll get there in a bit. It's got a hard-hitting main ability, the Lightning Storm, and some spellcasting that's largely useless but decent flavor. It's somewhat hardy, 230 hit points, but that won't be enough. Okay, I think we can work with this. Now we start treating the meat, rubbing in the spices and marinating and searing it. Good analogy. We're going to elevate the meat from its raw cut into a delicious standalone main course. There's nothing wrong with a standalone main course. Many fancy restaurants serve meat with minimal sides, but that's because they can cook it to perfection. Let's try and get our steak perfect. As in, let's elevate this Storm Giant into a boss monster. So how do you do that? Well, good end bosses break the rules of the game. They can do stuff when it isn't their turn. They have ways of resisting the player's stun locking abilities. Otherwise, the players can just outpace them in the action economy. So we have to give it some new features. First, we'll give it legendary actions. All other major boss monsters in the monster manual have them. So let's give it to our Storm Giant and boss. I could go invent new ones, but it's going to be more effective to just steal and adjust from other stat blocks. The ancient bronze dragon has Thunderclap. Let's steal it and put it on our giant. So it has a legendary AoE that can deafen players, and will inevitably force PCs into melee or tax the back rank. The elemental Cataclysm has rumbling movement, which lets it move without provoking attacks of opportunity, and nearby creatures must make saves to avoid falling prone. That seems flavorful. Let's steal it. It's good to give bosses movement as a legendary action. It avoids the battle from getting too locked down. This way, movement continues to matter. A fun interaction related to this, because the giant is fastest at swimming, means that it's incentivized to stay in the water when it can. Both of these legendary actions should only be possible once per round, so let's give it a reliable and repeatable action. Surge. The Storm Giant moves up to half its speed and then makes one Storm Sword attack. We could decide that the giant can do Thunderbolt with this action, but I think that'd make this character more someone who's incentivized to stay at range, and for some reason, it doesn't feel right to me. So we'll decide that it only works with a melee attack. That just feels right. That's 3 options for legendary actions. We'll say it can do 3 actions or 4 in its lair, like the dragons. But this doesn't defend the giant from getting stun-locked by a lucky failed save. So we'll have to bump its defenses. I'll use legendary resistances, probably stealing the dragon's version of it. Legendary resistance, 4 times a day or 5 times a day in the lair. If the dragon fails a saving throw, it can choose to succeed instead. There's a lot of people who don't like legendary resistances because they feel that players hate them. And there are alternatives, like in making the boss lose hit points when they use legendary resistances or something like that. But I kind of like legendary resistances, though I do run them with a few caveats. I typically roll boss monster saves in the middle of the table, and that way players can see the save, and they can see if the boss fails. And I then describe the boss reeling and shaking off the effect, and then I tell them, in no uncertain terms, they use the first of their legendary resistances. This way, the players know that the boss has those resistances, and they'll plan their spells around it. No save or suck, but save or half as a go until we're down to 0 resistances left. And I try to make sure that they understand where they're at the whole time, like they're chipping away at a second pool of hit points. Making sure to communicate they use their 5th and final legendary resistance, because at that point they'll all bust out the save or suck spells and the fight quickly ends after that. This mechanic gives the fight a shape, kind of a story, and it's a little arc inside the fight, like a side objective, getting the legendary resistances down to 0 while still being effective. One more addition for the boss monster variant of this creature: let's increase its attacks. Give it a 3rd attack with a Storm Sword, but as a bonus action. This way, the boss can be even more effective in melee, and by making it a bonus action, I've opened the door for a casting of Lightning Storm to be paired with a Storm Sword attack. Finally, I'm increasing the hit points. Another 10 hit dice brings the total up to 345. That seems better. I'm increasing the hit dice because I don't want the con saves to balloon too much. As a side note, you can adjust hit points in 3 ways: changing the con score, the amount of hit dice, or the size of the creature. Bigger creatures get bigger hit dice. I like adjusting the number of hit dice since it's the most arbitrary number anyway. Okay, I think this is a pretty good steak, but it's not a complete meal yet. Next up, some sides. How about potatoes? Everyone loves potatoes. Could be a baked potato or French fries. In our analogy, the potatoes are the lieutenants. You could have a single powerful lieutenant, or 2 or 3 lieutenants even. I wouldn't go much higher, or you start to veer into an elite team. For lieutenants, you're going to want more monsters that stay on theme to your end boss, but behave differently and are less powerful. You don't want them stealing the show, basically. You want their presence to make the boss more powerful, not just through damage, but through their abilities as well. In our example, let's have 2 lieutenants, a tank and a spellcaster. Let's say they're both giants, but one of them is a cloud giant and has the spellcasting of a mage. There's AoE spells. Sure, that's good, but more importantly, there's counterspell. The tank, meanwhile, will be a fire giant, but we'll add a bunch of the warrior commander's fun abilities like sap, counterattack, and tactical charge, and especially maneuver to help keep the boss safe. The players will want to kill these guys ASAP. What about something lighter and refreshing to balance the heaviness of those giant meat and potatoes? Well, kids, you gotta eat your greens. Or beans. Wait, eggplant is purple. Whatever, get your veggies on a plate. In our analogy, that means Mooks. These guys should be very squishy. You could even run them as 4th edition minions. Basically, they all have 1 hit point and die to whatever damage they take. That way you don't have to track anything. I'd suggest you make Mooks deal average damage numbers. That way you're only rolling to hit. In our case, let's make them all Sahuagin warriors and give them a ranged attack, since otherwise they'll be useless. These are Sahuagin that the Storm Giant corral to their side, pun intended. Next up, consider what to pair your giant steak with. Red wine is a classic, and for good reason. So what's the classic pairing for a big bad boss? An evil Lair, of course. You could let your work up until now inspire your lair. Look at what environments your boss monster lives in and weave that into the lair. Match the flavor. So, what is it for our Storm Giant? Well, remember the swim speed? This lair should be out at sea. Maybe there's a tower rising out of the ocean, lighthouse, something the Storm Giant can fly up to, or a deep pool that allows the giant to dive into and escape danger. The weather could even be controlled by the Storm Giant, and by extension, the entire battlefield. Your boss should have full control and knowledge of their lair. They should be in charge of it. What's also great about this particular choice of lair is that it pairs especially well with the minions. You can always have more Sahuagin come splashing out of the water. An especially good lair invites a fun approach to combat. Areas of difficult terrain, elevation, and cover. Go check out our video on Map Foo for more on all of that. If you're looking for amazing battle maps, you can find loads of them online, like this Phonic Lighthouse. No, I don't have a lisp, that's how you say it. The map itself is evocative, and you might describe it as strange alien light pours from the towering stained glass windows of the lighthouse, drawing ships to jagged rocks. Sailors give the island a wide berth, believing it to be cursed by a fell, otherworldly entity, luring unfortunate souls to their doom. This enormous, mind-bending fungi growing around this magnificent edifice emits a low, hypnotic dirge as they pulse with alluring prismatic hues. This map, the Phonic Lighthouse, is available with a bunch of annotated text and a lot more on bscribe.com, which is the sponsor of today's video. You've got loads of stuff like this Eldritch Lighthouse, and a powerful search engine. If you want access to a huge library of maps and descriptions, you can go check out Bscribe and use the promo code MysticArts for a 30-day free trial on any plan they offer. There's also a referral link in the description. Go check it out. Next up, some sauce. Not always necessary, but it does elevate the meal. For boss fights, give your party a tasty goal. I mean, obviously the goal is to kill the boss and end the adventure, so maybe a better question is there some kind of ticking clock? In Star Wars, the Death Star is moving into position to blow up the Rebel base. So if Luke doesn't make that shot into the blowy up hole, the Rebels become stardust. Set those stakes for your game, pun intended. An easy way to check if you've done this right is to fill in the blanks in this phrase. If we don't blank, then blank happens. For our ongoing example, if we don't kill the Storm Giant, he'll summon the Kraken. A Kraken? That sounds fun. I didn't know I was going to say just that. That's so cool. But that's the fun of this game. You can just make shit up. You then decide how long that'll take and keep reminding the players that a Titan might be around the corner. Feel free to make the odds of that happening super slim. This isn't a part of the encounter. It's actually a lose condition. As in, if the players lose this fight, then the campaign doesn't end tonight. There's a Kraken loose, and that'll have to be its own adventure, or at least its own boss fight. If you decide that the Kraken can show up in the encounter, then you need a different lose condition. Give it a moment and find your failure state. If we don't stop the Storm Giant today, then they'll sink water deep. Feel free to make the stakes big. If this is your end boss, you won't get a chance to make the stakes higher later. High-level play is about high stakes. Finally, the sixth ingredient, and maybe the most controversial take, I think no steak is complete without a garnish. Your little touch of specialty oddness makes the fight that much more memorable. Otherwise, you're just chowing on red meat. For me, that's the Mythic Phase. When your boss monster reaches 0 hit points, you put their HP back at max, and you do a handful of things to really kick the fight up a gear. You recharge the big AoE ability, and use it as a reaction. For our Storm Giant, it's the Lightning Storm. You upgrade the legendary actions into mythic actions, and now they can do those specialty actions every time it wants to. The Surge could now be 2 attacks, including 2 ranged attacks. That mechanic tells us a story. The Storm Giant doesn't need melee anymore. It's powerful without it. It takes to the sky, flies up to the tower, and rains lightning storms onto the players. Now they need to fight the giant on its own terms. At this stage in the fight, which is basically an entirely separate fight, the lieutenants and mooks are all probably dead, so the giant has to match the party's damage output all by itself. Let it do that. Embrace the insanity. Loads of people don't like Mythic Phases for a number of reasons, often related to it being weird that the hit points go to 0 twice, or that a creature gets a bloodied condition twice. At that point, it's mostly semantics. If you don't like the idea of going back to 100%, just give the giant more hit points and activate the second phase when it's bloodied. I'm sure that does the same job. But I think there's value in the monster becoming cooler as the fight goes on, because the players will be low on resources at that point, and now the boss is cooler. It dramatically increases the stakes. Make sure to describe this moment as best as you can, too. Describe the monster shedding its skin or assuming a form of light, or growing in size. You need to tell your players that they've triggered the second phase. Video games literally have the health bar refill. You can end your description by telling your players, and it activates its mythic phase and resets all lost hit points, or whatever phrase you find appropriate. Just communicate your intentions to the players. So, with that, you should have assembled a pretty spectacular plate of food, right? But you're still in the meat room. IKEA plate, butter knife, fluorescent lights. The presentation is still lacking. Don't just say what features the monster uses. Describe them as best you can. The storm giant hefts a bolt of lightning and throws it at Octavia the Paladin. Actually, why do we keep calling it a storm giant? It's no good. Let's call it Queen Zarella, the master of storms. She demands the loyalty of all giant kin after upending giant hierarchies to elevate herself above all others. Let's make a playlist of boss battle music. Let's pair it with sound effects. Let's draw a battle map and name the lieutenants. We'll see the ticking clock earlier in the fight. We'll make sure to tell the players about a horror story about a kraken's destructive capabilities. Like 5 months ago. Or failing that, at least the night before the fight. We'll sketch and render the details, add flavor, stakes references, tie giantkin into the adventure. If you're running online, find art and a token. If you're running in person, get a good mini. And this whole thing will start to come together. That's the power of presentation. Suddenly, we're in a candlelit restaurant. Oh, right, the butter knife. Make sure your players level up just before the battle starts. Your penultimate session ends with the boss showing up, the fight about to begin, and then you end the session, and you tell everyone to level up one last time. Give them that power boost. Ideally, try to tie this to a point in their characters' levels where they hit a new power threshold, like level 11 or 13, where the spells get more powerful and the marshals get their bigger abilities. Now your players can stab that giant with a proper steak knife. Your final session then starts with roll for initiative. I try to always make sure my end boss fights start at the beginning of a session. That way, there is space for an epilogue when we're done fighting. Lets them digest their food. Am I taking the analogy too far? I don't think so. Which brings me to a caveat here. You can overcook the meal. You might burn the steak, drench it in sauce, drown the baked potato in salt, and now the only way to make the meal palatable is by holding your nose. That would suck, since, people who order steaks generally want to taste their food. It's a double-edged sword, really. You know how in Marvel movies, all third act finale fights feel kind of the same? At a certain point, the movie becomes a huge, prevised CGI action sequence for about 30 minutes, guaranteed to produce excitement, at least to some degree. Sometimes it's a relief. You're watching Eternals, it's not hitting you right, and then the third act finale starts and you breathe a sigh of relief. The movie at least sticks the ending a bit, and now you can feel like it wasn't all that bad. Other times, like in Shang-Chi, you're left feeling disappointed that the Kung Fu movie also ended in a huge CGI slugfest. You don't have to do all 6 ingredients. You can mix and match, play around with expectations, skip Mooks for more lieutenants or skip lieutenants for more Mooks. Just make sure it fits your game and theme. And if you want something reliable, just stick to the 6 ingredient approach and it'll fit basically any game you want. Just make some preparation. I suggest if it's your first time, you start by developing the entire meal as I've described, and then start fiddling around with the options as you run more adventures and more boss fights. I often find that a satisfying boss fight can elevate an otherwise mediocre adventure, like Eternals. So I'd suggest you give yourself a bit of time to play around with this. Pick the cut, marinate, rub, select sides, garnish, pair with a drink and present in a palatable and appetizing way. I think that'll work. If you like food analogies tied to D&D, I may have been inspired by fellow dungeon tuber Naigobi, and her video Can Cooking Help You Become a Better Dungeon Master? She's a fantastic creator, and you folks will probably get a kick out of her videos. I was lucky enough to get to voice a character in her upcoming video. Subscribe to see that. That's where we'll pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching this video. This channel is run by me and my girlfriend, and if you want to support directly, consider joining our Patreon. Any member or patron gets access to our exclusive Discord, where we hang out with a bunch of you folks and we talk about the game, books, animals, obsidian, whatever it is you're interested in. And if you're feeling especially generous, you might like this video, comment, share, or subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when we release new videos. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.